Okay, today I am going to try to do a short rebuttal to Lionel Nation. Some of you who view my channel probably found me through Lionel Nation, and I'm a huge admirer of his intellect and the amount of real uh, inside knowledge and insight that he brings to many of the topics that he talks about. One of the things I disagree with him about is economic policy. And I've actually made a rebuttal before, was a little more on edge about it. But this time, I don't think that it's really that big of a deal to say that his, worship of the FDR model of economics, where you see increased use of spending from the top, basically Keynesian economics on steroids. I think he's completely missing the point. Now, he went on a kind of a rant today, and a lot of the things he was saying, they resonate with people who believe that federal monetary policy can be done independent of the reaction of the world and the banking system. Now, don't take this as an endorsement of the Federal Reserve or the world, the IMF or the world banking system. Basically, what Lionel said was that all of this crap that's going down in Venezuela is an illusion, and that really their economic downfall is the fault of the IMF and oil commodity manipulation and things like that. When in reality, Venezuela was once a much more diversified economy than it used to be. Okay, it used to be one where there was very large private sector manufacturing. That it was obviously oil was always a large part of the economy. I'm not going to deny that, but under its leadership, they neglected reinvesting a lot of the funds in updating and maintaining the oil sector of the economy, PDVSA, the state-owned oil company. I think it's completely state-owned by now. I could be wrong. However, so they not only that, they replaced the the professional leadership of PDVSA with political cronies of the Chavez regime and later Maduro. And that's basically where we are today, with a regime where oil production is basically tanking and the government can do absolutely nothing to prevent the free fall of its economy. So it basically forces people to give up their civil liberties. And that, in my mind, they're doing that without any connection to the IMF or the international banking system. Yes, they're very convenient excuses, but not every country that has adverse relations with the international banking system sinks into a totalitarian dictatorship. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but Greece hasn't yet. Unfortunately, they are being basically tipped over and shaken free of all their money by international banking system. But they know that the alternative to that is basically economic ruin, and they've already gone through economic ruin by pursuing policies of basically large scale state spending with no goal in sight. And that's what FDR's policies amounted to. This is a person who started massive capital projects in the United States that he believed would retrieve it from the Depression. But that it's a very quaint debate whether FDR's policies rescued the United States from the Depression or whether the U.S. entering World War II and the arms industry withdrew it from the Depression. Now, I think obviously he did a number of things that helped. He did restore American confidence in the country as a whole after Hoover lost the country's confidence in the leadership of the federal government. But you have to remember that during those years before World War II, FDR was by no means this exalted figure among everybody. There were plenty of people who viewed him as basically some sort of evil angel who was coming to destroy all their liberties and put them under the tyranny of either communism or fascism or something in between. There was Huey Long of Louisiana, who wanted him to go even harder and basically socialize the U.S. economy. So then you have on the right, you have what they call the bankers coup of Smedley Butler apparently exposed it. People talk about these issues for, they're still under debate. The legacy of FDR is still under debate. But what cannot be under debate is that he overstepped his bounds as an American president. Think about it this way: there hasn't been another American president, to my knowledge, that tried to pack the Supreme Court because they kept knocking down his decision, his policies as unconstitutional. Like it or not, the judicial branch exists as a check and balance against the encroachment of federal authority into places where it doesn't belong. It shouldn't be used as the only obstacle to change. Obviously, if there's an amendment to the Constitution, or if there's certain policies that are constitutional, we don't want the Supreme Court to legislate from the bench. But they weren't legislating from the bench under FDR. They were dealing with a number of policies that he promulgated that were unconstitutional. They violated the authority of the federal government over the states in most of the cases. And there's no better example of just the destruction wreaked by FDR's statist policies than his policies towards Native Americans. And I have here for you, this is from The Roots of Dependency by Richard White. It says here, Navajos protested that renewed drought made their horses more necessary than ever and denounced their councilmen for voting for a reduction, but they complied. This is a result, this is due to a program where the federal government decided, because of the preponderance of Indian livestock in some parts of the Southwest, the federal government would kill by force, confiscate by force, and kill a lot of their livestock. So, reading from here, it says the low prices paid for the horses and the slaughter of many of them only increased their anger and resentment. By the end of the drive in 1939, 14,000 horses, or 1/4 of all those the Navajos owned, had been sold, most for between $2 and $4 a head. The government had met concerted resistance in only 2 northern districts, Units 9 and 12. Unit 9, Tiknaspos, was one of the original districts targeted for horse reduction, was isolated and strongly traditional with a history of active opposition to the government. Unit 12, centered on Shiprock, was far more acculturated and had previously been one of Morgan's main centers of support. Morgan is one of the administrators of the program. In these districts, the government resorted to the tribal courts to punish the resistors, and apparently some people who refused to have their horses rounded up and branded were jailed. In at least one instance, the result of such enforcement was violence. In January of 1940, the trial of Kitty Black Horse and 3 others for refusing to brand their horses ended in an uproar when Black Horse and his sons disrupted the trial and armed supporters invaded the court. Black Horse himself escaped and went into hiding. When tribal courts failed to secure reduction, Fryer took the cases into the federal courts of Utah and Arizona. The government decided to single out the leaders of resistance for prosecution. None of them were large stock owners. Most grazed from 200 to 600 sheep units. These were men who could live on their existing herds, but who, if the government succeeded in reducing Unit 9 to its maximum herd limit of 83 sheep units, would be forced below subsistence. Fryer admitted that from the standpoint of equity, cases against these men would be hard to try, but he nonetheless considered them critical in the movement from laissez-faire to conservation. The Arizona cases were filed in Phoenix on June 28, 1940, and went to trial in September, despite attempts by an armed band of Navajos to prevent the serving of notices to the defendants. The court decided in favor of the government, upholding reduction once more. When the defendants still refused to comply, the government instituted contempt proceedings. Although one defendant, Councilman Kit Seeley, then paid I think think I ran out of space, but you get the point. FDR's policies were not about the little guy. FDR's policies were about the federal government basically managing the entire nation and going into the little nitty-gritty details. And if that's the way they behaved towards these uh, small holding herders, Indian herders in the Southwest, I mean, they were doing the same thing around the country with various industries. Now, obviously, it didn't reach full-blown communism, partially thanks to the outbreak of World War II, because they needed the armaments industry in order to be able to ramp up production and design resources to combat Germany and Japan and Italy. But when you look at FDR's presidency as a whole, you see the elements of a totalitarianism just increasing the whole time. It's not. I think if he would have lived longer than he did, you would have seen a similar situation to what happened in Venezuela following World War II. You would have seen just a constant encroachment of the federal government into the private sphere of life. And I will never support something like that. He instituted Social Security. Social Security was a groundbreaking program for its time, but it was also a program that envisioned that people would only live, I believe, till the age of 60. And nowadays we know that that's simply not sufficient. That people live longer, and therefore Social Security will become insolvent as people live longer, and the government has to pay out more money to the people that are that are entitled to it, based under the Social Security Act of whatever it is, 1933. So, there were a lot of policies that Lionel was advocating for in his talk that are just darlings of the political left. And they always say, well, if we just weren't involved in wars, if we weren't involved in X, if we didn't spend so much money on this, we could afford that. Well, yeah, there's certain policies. Let's say if we zeroed out immigration and we deported a lot of the unskilled immigrants from the United States. Yeah, I think universal health care could be achieved because you would have a more limited pool of sick and poor people to deal with. But it's not going to be that easy. It's not going. What Lionel is talking about is basically saying, well, this other country has this. Why aren't we? Why do we, the most rich country in the world, why can't we afford that? I'm sorry, but there's countries right next to us that have it, such as Mexico. Mexico has I don't believe they have the best form of universal health care, but they have it. Well, why isn't Mexico such a thriving economy? They have low-wage workers. They have they have a fairly free economy, but they also have massive gun control. Why isn't Mexico as prosperous as the United States? Well, there's a number of factors. You can't just attribute it to one thing, but saying that universal health care is something that we should adopt just because other countries who we consider successful have adopted it is ridiculous. They always talk about Sweden. They talk about Northern Europe, especially, which includes Sweden, as being the model that we should focus on to build our healthcare system. I'm sorry, but Sweden hasn't been at a war since the early 19th century. Now, is that something we would want? Sure. Is that realistic? No. Almost every country in the world has been involved in the war in the last 200 years. It's a fact. We should aspire not to be in as many wars, but to claim that we should be like a country that has managed to enforce neutrality and leave itself out of major defense pacts in the past 200 years, it's just not something that is within the realm of reality for right now. You can look at some of these other countries. Britain, they have recently canceled 50,000 surgeries due to overload in their government hospital system, their universal health care system. Is that because of universal health care? Not necessarily. There are other factors. One of the factors is their crazy refugee population that just keeps exploding. So, what's the country you would model an American universal health care system on that would be successful? Probably Japan. And how would you accomplish that? By completely zeroing out immigration. And Lionel Nation forgets to mention that as a necessary price to accomplish this. The United States, I don't think, is capable of zeroing out immigration the way Japan does. We can't become Japan. I love Japan. I think it's a fantastic country. But just gazing at other countries and saying, well, they succeeded in doing this. Why can't we do it? Well, other countries saw us go to the moon and they said, well, why can't we do that? Uh, I think a couple of them did. I don't remember at the moment. Some people say we didn't go to the moon, but just looking at somebody else's horse and thinking, oh, that horse is faster than mine, without knowing what price it takes to raise that horse, is a common mistake. And I think Lionel, I respect him. I think he's a brilliant mind. I know he's listening to that Caleb Maupin, who I call the Ginger. I always do the deport the Ginger hashtag on his channel. It's enough already. We get it. You love FDR. FDR was basically, but behind the scenes, he was a monster, just like a lot of people. He was. A lot of people don't know that he was a philandering cheater. Okay, is that something that we should judge him for historically? I think there's plenty of presidents we don't know about their indiscretions, whose indiscretions we don't know about. I think it's understandable that there should be some flaws with somebody, but this is a guy I fully believe if FDR did not have polio, we would have seen a different side of him after the war. This is a guy who had no problem collaborating with Stalin during the war. I mean, obviously, there was a need to defeat Hitler. But with Churchill, at least you saw an apprehension towards cooperating with Stalin. And then Lionel is fine with dumping on Churchill for, certain bad things that Churchill did during his career, including the Indian famine. Basically, I think he's missing the point. We are living in an era where the encroachment of the federal government on people's lives, on the lives of even people at very senior levels, is the effects are just becoming obvious. They create an atmosphere where systems just spin out of control and they become creatures of their own desire, if I'm putting that correctly. They become basically Frankenstein's monster. That's the way our federal government has become, the FBI, the CIA, but also federal agencies that have run amok for years. There's that, people talk about the EPA. In my former line of work, it was the FDA. We cannot continue to live in a society where people are constantly checking behind their back whether the federal government is ready to zap them and open up a can of whoop ass. So, I'll let you guys judge. There's a little more background in the description if you want to check it out. And I think it's a debate worth having. I think he brings up a good topic, but I think he's just spectacularly wrong about it.